Hello and welcome to Sustainapod, a podcast produced by young people for young people about sustainability. We talk with professionals and changemakers about what it takes to build a more sustainable present and future, sharing the stories, tips, and insights for you to take action. Today, we're talking all about food sustainability. Multiple recent reports have promoted sustainable diets as an important strategy to mitigate climate change. But beyond that, sustainable diets are also about ensuring access to food security and nutrition. We'll be talking about sustainable food, what it means, what it looks like, in particular when it comes to feeding our next generation, so our students. You'll be hearing from Anthony Dixon, the chairman of the Alliance for Sustainable Schools, as well as Yi-Mei Liu and Iris Wang, who are two Year 13 students from Chinese International School in Hong Kong. Yi-Mei and Iris represent Drop in the Ocean, CIS's environmental student group focused on implementing sustainable initiatives in school. So Anthony, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Belinda. Thank you.
So let's kick it off by talking more about partnerships and collaborations, because that's very key to what TASS is doing. Could you give us an introduction to what is TASS and how and why this network was formed?
Yes, certainly. So TASS is a network of schools around the world that are working together on key sustainability challenges that are relevant to schools. And the idea came about because I've spent a number of years working with individual schools and students in those schools and developing or reducing the environmental footprint of individual schools. But I began to realize that there were some bigger issues at play here that would benefit from a collaborative effort between schools. And the classic example is a conversation between a single school and a supplier. Maybe it's a bus company, maybe it's a food company. That single school has limited leverage with that supplier. But if you were to put all the supplier's clients in a single room, if they had 50 schools asking for sustainable food or 50 schools asking for a sustainable bus service, the dynamics of the conversation changes. So that was the genesis of the idea of an alliance of schools working together for sustainability. And the second key thing was that sustainability in a school is a multifaceted equation, and there are so many things that could be done, but not all of them are of equal importance in terms of reducing the environmental footprint, and not all of them require a systems level approach and a collaborative effort of many schools in order to make a difference. So what we did was to identify the 5 top things that contribute to most schools' environmental footprint. And I think this is true of any school you care to name around the world. And that is buses, food, uniforms, buildings, and of course the pedagogy, the education for sustainability. Not only what we teach in the schools, but how we teach it. And so what TASS does is focus our lobbying efforts, if I can use that word, on those 4 issues. In particular, try to take this sort of systems level approach where we ask ourselves the question, why is food not sustainable right now in the school system? What are the actors and relationships and historical habits of mind that contribute to the way things are right now? And then by following the threads back to the source, try to identify the levers where if we push on them, we'll get the maximum likelihood of some kind of change across the system. So that's a little bit about where this idea all started. And we've now been in operation for about a year, and the model is working. I'd say we've had some small but very significant successes in a number of these 5 areas, and we've got terrific response from the schools around the world in terms of joining up to the mission of what we're trying to do together.
That's amazing, and I think it's so needed, this industry, you can call it industry, I guess, an industry collaboration of schools. I'm curious to know more about what do you think has been some of the challenges that has happened in this past year and some key learning points about that when fostering a systems change, because this is by no means an easy feat.
That's right, and systems change by definition is difficult because systems tend to resist change by their very nature. And so you have to put a lot of energy into a system to get it to change to a different to a different state. There's all sorts of things at work here. So, but I think we've been pleasantly surprised at the successes we've managed to have so far. And I think a big contributing factor to that is student engagement. It is one thing for, a head of school or a head of operations in a school to make the case to a bus company or a food company that there needs to be more sustainability in the goods and services they're delivering. It's a whole other thing if you get 10 students in the room making that argument. It's a lot harder to, first of all, it's a lot harder to say no, I think, to that request. It's also a lot harder to dodge the question, right? Or to make up excuses, because the students are going to be shooting from the hip. It's, after all, it's the students whose futures at stake here, and they're heavily invested in trying to make changes, and TASS enables some of those opportunities for them, to work on real world conversations. So one of our student ambassadors, I remember the look on her face when, after a meeting where she had the CEO of a bus company sitting in the boardroom of the school, along with the head of the school and senior operation people and her fellow student ambassadors. And she was like, wow, by writing a letter, by making a request to the key people, I made this happen. And that's the kind of empowerment that we're looking for, that really enables those students to take the learning from that experience and replicate it in their university life in future years, or their jobs, their place of work, even in their family life. So the ripple effects of what we're doing spread out into the community and also across time, in future years. We're changing mindsets, and that begins to have a snowball effect.
That's really fantastic. And also I think another point to add to what you're saying about systems changes, making sure everyone involved in the system is also involved or implicated in some way by the action. So engaging the students, the bus companies, the teachers, everyone sounds really great. I was also wondering more, let's turning to food. What's the vision for sustainable school food that TASS is advocating for? What is the end goal in relation to this specific advocacy area?
Well, in the first instance, it's fairly modest. The food that we see in most schools in the canteens is not sustainable. Sustainability simply, for most of our members in this part of the world to date, and I'm sure there are a few exceptions. There are exceptions, both within our network and outside of it. But for the most part, sustainability is not an issue that, until very recently, has been part of the discussion. Parents care a lot about the food that is served in the school canteens, and they weigh in on things like how healthy is it, how safe is it, where's it, in terms of where the food is being procured from, and how much meat is on the menu usually, and then how much does it cost. But sustainability is missing from that conversation until really very recently. So we want to change that. We want to just get sustainability as part of the conversation, and then hopefully we want to make it part of the procurement decision, so that the procurement teams in schools start to interrogate, if I can use that word, the bidders for these tenders when they come up, as to what their sustainability policy is. How do they actually verify that what they're serving in the canteens are truly truly sustainable, and what do they mean by that? And also among the parent community, to start to get parents to pay attention to this. Now, there's a lot of assumptions that have not been challenged, I think, when we bring this question up. And the caterers that we talk to often say, well, the reason we don't serve sustainable food, or we don't pay attention to the question of sustainability, or as much attention as you would like, is that it's not what the clients want. Clients aren't asking for it. Well, we've done some research involving students where we looked at the sustainability of 12 months worth of procurement for a school canteen, and 3 months in the case of another school. And the caterers were very transparent. Here's all our data for the last 12 months. And we analysed it with the students' help, and we compared it to a benchmark sustainable diet, something the scientists have called the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet. And what it showed was, among other things, there's 3 times as much meat being served in school canteens than what the scientists say is going to be sustainable in a few years' time. And there's only about 1/20th of the plant-based protein being served in school canteens than the scientists say ought to be the case if we're to live, sustainably on the planet from a food point of view. So there's enormous opportunities here or enormous need for change. And the students who presented this research defended it by saying, look, or argued against the caterers who said, well, nobody's asking us to do sustainable food. It's not really a big issue. And if we served it, we don't think people would actually eat it. And the students' reply was, well, how do you know that? And actually, you're out of touch with our peers. We know what our peers' eating preferences are. And, 25% of my class are vegetarians, 5% of them are vegans. I'm a vegan myself. This was the students speaking to the senior management of the catering companies. I may be wrong, but I don't believe that any thorough market research about students' dietary preferences has been done in recent years in schools. And in the absence of that, people are just, perpetuating what they've always done for the last 2 or 3 decades, which is to serve lots of meat on the menu and different shades of it, and then serve it up with a salad. And that has to change, and we want to challenge some of those assumptions.
That's a fantastic journey. I think one thing I really took away is that the importance of communication between the different stakeholders, but also transparency and tapping into the levers that will be able to drive that change. So specifically for the Earth Day Sustainable School Food Summit, could you share a little bit more about how this came about and yeah, how you found the whole experience, as we'll be hearing from the students after this.
Yeah, look, so the idea came about because, what we're trying to do at the Alliance for Sustainable Schools is demonstrate the feasibility of alternatives to the status quo. Right? So instead of talking about can you do it, can't you do it, is it more expensive, is it less expensive, will students eat it, will they not? Let's just take one simple example. We invited 3 celebrity chefs to design 3 school lunch meals at a certain price point and serve them to 100 students who attended this conference, this summit. And the meals were a resounding success. So the students loved what they had to eat. They found it interesting. They engaged really well with the educational materials and amongst each other in discussion about which ones they preferred and why, and which ones are more sustainable, and so on. And I think so. The overall event was it really had an impact, and it had an impact not only on the students but also on the caterers who attended, on the chefs who got to participate, on the members of staff who were in the wings as attendees as well. And the ripple effect from this is that the caterers have committed to serving those 3 dishes in all the schools they serve in Hong Kong for the next 12 months. So they'll be featured on the menu, and they serve 50 million meals. Well, no, I think it's 80 million meals in 50 schools in Hong Kong in the next 12 months. So this is not every one of those is going to be a sustainable low carbon meal, but a significant proportion of them. Just the fact that sustainable options that are verifiably sustainable appear on the menu, I think, is a big breakthrough. So the day was structured in 3 parts. We first had a visionary look ahead from Sonali Figueres, the locally known as the Green Queen. She talked about what are we going to be eating in 2050? What's the future of food? And then the second part of it was let's taste what's possible. Let's taste these chefs' meals and let's see, are they more or less interesting than what's already being served, just from a preference point of view. And then the third part was the students asking questions, really putting the CEOs of the caterers on the hot seat and saying, what are you doing about this? Okay, there's some challenges, but let's move beyond the challenges. What's your commitment to changing the direction of this issue? So it was overall a very engaging event, one with long-lasting impact, and I can see it's something that we will do annually, and not just in Hong Kong, but we're already in discussions with schools in other parts of the world to replicate this, because it's a model that we think is really got some wings and it's going to make a difference.
So as you mentioned earlier, education for sustainability is one of the 5 key pillars for what TASS does. So applying it to sustainable food systems and diets, what do you think are effective ways to create the impact through education and teach students about the importance of sustainable diets and food systems?
Yeah, I think there's three things. The first thing is that when it comes to education for sustainability, we need to move away from just teaching about sustainability. In other words, what a sustainable diet looks like, what an unsustainable diet looks like, and reinforcing that with opportunities for the students to actually take action, whether it's to drive change at a systemic level or to reflect and moderate their own individual choices. So that's an important point, and I think the sort of cutting edge of education for sustainability these days is really places an emphasis on that. It's not just learning in the classroom, but it's engaged learning in the real world. The second thing I would say is that there's very little material available or education that takes place in canteens. And you walk into a school canteen and maybe there's a poster about which options are vegetarian, but there's really not a lot of high quality education. Education obviously doesn't just take place in the classroom, and I think we're missing an opportunity to really teach about this question of sustainable food in the canteen itself. And in my mind, there's a really vivid image of students huddled around some material that we provided at the summit, which contained descriptions of the menus and the carbon footprint and the ingredients and where they came from and how they grew. And the students really loved that. They got engaged in a really lively conversation about that information. And I want to see that in schools, school canteens everywhere. So we have to collectively, in schools, to provide educational material in the right place that's interesting and accessible and engaging. And then the third thing is peer-to-peer teaching and learning, right? And the students at the summit were a big part of the information that was presented. And they presented about one of the keynote topics about sustainable food. And I think other students are much more receptive to peer-to-peer communication on this topic than they are to adults in the classroom telling them the good and bad things about what they're eating. So those are the three aspects of education for sustainability that I think are relevant to the food question.
So next you'll be hearing up from Yi-Mei and Iris, more specifically about their experiences of the event itself. So Yi-Mei and Iris, welcome to the podcast. Very excited to have you here and share your story. So I'll start off with you, Yi-Mei. Could you tell us more about what this summit was and what were its key aims?
So thank you, Belinda, for that warm welcome. Regarding the summit, it was an event that aimed to elevate conversation around sustainable food systems, specifically sustainable school food, and what students could do to drive change. So it was a space where interested students could connect with industry experts and NGOs to talk about sustainable food, learn about what it is, and in the end, even taste a bit of the sustainable food and see what could be its future.
Thanks for sharing that, Yi-Mei. And I know that this was a very collaborative effort. There was also TASS, the Alliance for Sustainable Schools, and also working with grassroots initiatives, so Zero Food Print Asia, and also working with CIS. So, Iris, could you share a little bit more about what that process was working with these various different people and organizations to establish this summit?
I think overall it was a very collaborative process. We had to meet with the other sustainable consulting groups every week to sort of update on our progress and shape the summit into what we wanted it to be like. And so we kind of discussed about what the topic of the summit would be like, because originally we were thinking about something more broad of sustainability in general, and then we kind of focused more towards school food and the sort of the structure of the day was something we kind of collaborated with the other groups to figure out.
Just to add on to that, I do really want to emphasize how important these other groups were in helping the summit turn out the way it did, because it went really well. It went beyond my expectations, and a lot of that came down to the people who are helping us. Without TASS, without metanoia, without grassroots initiatives, we would have had a very hard time reaching out to all the speakers, the workshop hosts, the panelists, the experts, the chefs, and all of that, because they had the contacts, they had the people, they had the connections, and they really helped us and were really supportive throughout the entire process. So thank you to them for that.
That's fantastic. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what actually happened on the day. You mentioned there were some workshops, there were some speakers sharing. So can you share a little bit more about what the content was and any kind of key takeaways that you still like remember from that has really affected the way that you understand sustainable food systems?
So the day was kind of split into 3 sections. The first was to learn, or I guess teach the students there more about sustainable food. So we had a guest speaker, Sonali Figueres, who's the founder of many things, but most importantly, Green Queen, which is this very big media platform focused around sustainability. And she talked a lot about what it meant to, like, what sustainable food systems meant and solutions in the future. And then there was a student presentation run by members of Ditto that talked about the Eat Lancet diet, which is basically the ideal diet that is both healthy for the eater and for the planet. And then after that first block of the day, it moved on to workshops where the students could interact with a bunch of NGOs and experts of their choosing, and then do a little mini hands-on activity. For example, one of the workshops was doing an analysis on a school food diet, taking a sample meal and then seeing how well that lined up with the Eat Lancet diet, and then figuring out what needs to change and what's the, like, and getting a good grasp of how sustainable your current diet is. And then for the last part of the day, this is not last part of the day, but for lunch, what was the most exciting part of the day arguably was the competition, in which 3 celebrity chefs made 3 dishes, or 3 sustainable dishes. So these were plant-based, they were cheap, they were healthy, they were nutritious, based on a list of criteria, and served it for lunch. And everyone got to try and then vote for their favorite, and then panelists could review it, and there was this whole event. And these 3 dishes are now being served in a bunch of Hong Kong schools whose catering company agreed to serve these dishes, and that was the real tangible change that we wanted to leave behind, because, we didn't want the summit just to be talking at students. And for the last part of the summit, it was all about moving forward. Now you've had a taste of what was possible. The students have had hands-on experience trying to analyze their own food. They've learned about it in the beginning of the day, and now it was an opportunity for them to ask 3 panelists, which were all people in the school food industry, their thoughts, and learn about what they thought was the right move moving forward, what was plausible, testing out ideas. So that was how we structured the day.
Yeah, I think together with the school lunch auditing sort of workshop, we also had a couple of parallel workshops that ran at the same time. And these were run by some outside organizations that we invited in, because we kind of wanted the students to get an idea of sort of different aspects of the food system. So people who are producing the food, farms, and just that group of food production, and then also people involved in food waste and pollution, and like the packaging pollution, and also people from seafood associations. So it's sort of, we wanted to kind of have people from different aspects of the food industry to come talk to the students, so that we'd get a better understanding of the entire sort of system. And yeah.
Fantastic. There's so much to get into from that very, very rich day, it sounds like. So I wanted to ask specifically first about the sustainable dish competition. What was it about the dishes that made it more quote unquote sustainable? Because for many people, they might think it's just because it's vegan, it's sustainable, or just because it's sourced in a certain way, it's sustainable. So can you explain more it was that made these dishes more sustainable, the different components?
Okay, so to design these 3 dishes, each of the chefs were given like a criteria, and they were kind of given free rein on how they wanted to take it, but all 3 dishes did share some characteristics in that they were plant-based. For example, one of them was based on like a sweet and sour chicken dish, but instead of chicken, they used jackfruit. And all of them were used ingredients that were sourced locally. So these were all kind of stereotypical sustainable dishes, but the thing is that that is what makes food sustainable. One point that was kind of emphasized is that sourcing does play a relatively minimal role in what makes a dish sustainable. And a lot of what makes a dish sustainable and what lowers its carbon footprint is what ingredients it uses, right? That's basically what it comes down to, right? If you use beef, you really can't make anything sustainable. So it's all about trying to find ingredients that work to replace these, staples that have higher carbon footprints. And I think a large part of what turns people off of sustainable food is the idea that it's vegan or it's vegetarian and thus it must be bad. But the thing that all these 3 chefs did in this competition was they tried to use novel, low carbon footprint ingredients in ways that people were used to. For example, with the jackfruit, it was emulating chicken, and it was a familiar dish that a lot of people ended up liking because it didn't taste like jackfruit, it tasted like chicken. Or not exactly the same, but close enough that people liked it. It wasn't something gross or disgusting or unfamiliar.
It's really, really
Uh,
interesting. Anything you want to add, Iris?
yeah, to add on, I think another part of the like getting these students to try the dishes itself, also Yi-Mei kind of mentioned, is part of there's the misconception that people think sort of plant-based or like sustainable dishes are like not as tasty, or that they need like meat to taste good or fulfill you. And so I think that was something that the chefs wanted to tackle. And like by the students like getting they got the opportunity to try these dishes on the day, and they were also quite small portions, so they could have like they could actually try all 3 of them if they wanted to. And so that kind of helped them sort of see that like plant-based food isn't like the just fake meat or not good, not tasty. And I think that's a really big element if we wanted to, because we wanted to implement these dishes into the school menus next year. And so we wanted to make sure that the students themselves would know that like this food is good as well. So on the day they got to try out the food for themselves in the school year, they would know that this is good and they would actively eat it. And that would also help their classmates see that this is good and they will also try it. So I think that's also a pretty important element.
Yeah, that's really important for sure. I think what you're really touching on is just the challenges of enabling this dietary shift. And it's great that there's, this gradual easing into it. Like the students are given the chance to vote, have that agency to decide and really prioritize, for example, taste, which is going to be really important if we're to make a change this sustainable. So I also wanted to ask more about, the external organizations, because it was fantastic that you got to interact with players up and down the food value chain from production to the end of the life cycle. So food waste, what happens after it's, left over, and the other industry players. So starting with you, Yi-Mei, could you share a little bit more about something interesting that you learned from engaging with these different organizations about the food system and how it operates, or about sustainability more generally?
Okay, this is less about how the food system operates, but this one conversation during the panel I had with Matt Reed, who is the founder of a startup that focuses on providing sustainable food called Kin Food. And he basically painted a very pessimistic image of the food system. He was like, this entire system is broken, it's built on making profit, it is built to emit, and it has to change. The whole thing has to restart. And I was like, wow, this is such a pessimistic way to view sustainability, right? Think that the entire system needs to be torn down, right? It's a very easy path to cynicism and like doomerism and thinking like there's no point in trying anymore because the whole thing is messed up. But then afterwards, he was like, even though he holds this very pessimistic view on the food system, he still manages to do the work he does, right? He still keeps going and trying to provide food in the most sustainable way he can with his startup. And I think the way he approaches this doomerism and pessimism is honestly really inspiring as someone who does hear a lot of negative things, and everyone hears a lot of negative things, and the first reaction is to just throw up our hands up in the air and said, oh no, everything's so bad. But he compartmentalizes it and then still manages to do what he can. And I guess that's what a lot of people in the battle against climate change is doing, right? They're compartmentalizing it and they're just saying, I gotta do what I can. And I think it's just a really powerful message for everyone who cares, like especially young people, us, that the only really thing to do is to do whatever we can.
I love that. How about you, Iris?
Yeah, I think from this sort of seeing the different sides of the like food system, the food industry, you kind of get a wider picture of the entire system. I remember one of the things I remember just really clearly from because I was in like I was listening to the seafood workshop, and I remember the the expert was saying how like there's a misconception that in Hong Kong the seafood overfishing overall is a really big issue, but he actually said that the overfishing overall is not as big of an issue as it is made out to be. However, it's those selective species is overfishing of those selective species is a really big issue, and that is actually attributed to the seafood labeling system in Hong Kong. That was something I didn't really think about before, but because like when fish are like fished from the sea, it's it's difficult to sort of pin down the exact species of the fish. And so actually most of the time the seafood that you see in like supermarkets, there's a high probability that the fish isn't labeled correctly, and that's a really big issue for things tracking in the seafood industry and where the fish is going. And then I think another thing that I sort of noticed is that like within these organizations or initiatives, they're doing some really cool stuff. But a lot of the times, some of these are kind of like a lot of the people who might not be actively involved in sustainability like advocacy or aren't really like purposefully seeking to know sort of the entire process kind of only see one particular side. Like they might only kind of see the food waste side or like how one particular organization is doing something, but it's much more difficult to sort of paint the entire picture, and that's really difficult for people to kind of see exactly where the food is coming from and then where it's going after consumption. And so I think just getting to see all those different workshops from different people definitely gave me a better idea of sort of the whole process. And I hope that the students who participated in the summit also got that out of the day.
Wow, that's fascinating. The point about seafood. Hong Kong is per capita one of the world's biggest consumers of seafood. So I think it's really interesting that both of you guys are touching on the idea of what's actually being served and where it's being sourced, so provenance and what is happening upstream before it even reaches the plate, but also the education piece, right? How are consumers making that choice, and are consumers sufficiently educated about the environmental impacts of what they're actually eating? So I also wanted to ask you two, what do you think are some of the key challenges moving forward that will need to be overcome to enable this wider scaling up of sustainable school food in canteens? There's been some very fantastic progress made from this conference, as you said, Yi-Mei, with some of the dishes that are now being served. So what else do we need to do to ensure that this is a norm across all schools in Hong Kong that serve canteen food?
I guess it's not just for schools, but for sustainable food in general. For how consumers work is that how the whole thing works is that what is being served in the end depends on the consumers and what they want. So in order to move forward, there has to be like a greater acceptance from the student body that like this is what we want to eat. Like they'll sustainable foods is what we want to eat, because we do, for example, our school tried implementing Green Mondays, in which every Monday the food served would be all vegan and all vegetarian. But the problem was that everyone always complained about them, like they just didn't go eat school lunch in that day. Whenever we had vegetarian options, like they would just always be the last one left where no one would get it. And the thing is that if we wanted, to introduce more of these sustainable options, then we have to do it in a way where students will actually eat them. Whether that means like trying to, I guess, serve familiar dishes, but instead replace certain ingredients, or just simply focus on like a few high emitting carbon foods, like maybe just cut down on beef and then maybe pork and then slowly make our way down. It has to, it's a slow, it has to, we have to somehow persuade students and consumers in general to move away from these high emitting foods and into some other ingredients. But of course, it's going to be a process. But yeah, eliminating one thing at a time, changing one thing at a time, that's the way it starts, I think.
I think another part of getting the students to eat those plant-based food is, I know that like, for example, in our school, there's a lot of education on like sustainability and like carbon emissions and the impact. I think that sort of needs to be more widespread, and just so that it's like more of a common knowledge thing. And that, because a lot of the times, for example, especially I know that in when Ditto we do activities, a lot of the times the people who show up for to see or participate in those activities will be people who are interested in sustainability, and they choose to be there to learn more. And that's obviously very good, because people are obviously interested. But then to get more people involved and get the wider student body to participate, I think something we have to do something to convince those people who are less willing to be involved in sustainability to see what we're doing, and then also understand that why we're doing this. This kind of sounds something that we should have moved past, but I think a lot of people already sometimes have those misconceptions, or they kind of just don't really want to be involved, and we have to do something to try and get those people to be involved for there to be a wider impact.
So I guess one thing is that a lot of people kind of view eating sustainably as some kind of sacrifice or an expense, in which they're sacrificing an ingredient that they really love, and replace and having to like pick something that they don't as much. And I guess that through education, through this more widespread doing things more widespread, as Iris was talking about, that notion could be slowly like undone, for lack of a better word, and that there's a lot of options out there that are sustainable. Like, sustainable food doesn't have to be just one thing, right? There's no one dish that's sustainable. It's a whole range of things. It's more like what is not that sustainable and trying to get those out of the diet instead of trying to pick a certain select sustainable dishes instead. I think if it comes with it happens with time. If more people eat it, more people get used to it, and hopefully we can all, move towards a more sustainable future.
That's such a good point, and I really love that you two are really digging into the nuances of what it is to be having a sustainable diet. I think I just love to add to along this line of what you were just saying, Yi-Mei, about balance. There's no need for everyone to be vegetarian or vegan overnight forever. There's flexitarian diets where essentially you're just reducing your intake of meat, but you're also able to enjoy it occasionally. And in many ways, making that shift already is going to create some kind of impact. So I definitely agree so much that there's a lot that needs to be done from an awareness raising education standpoint to really drive a more cultural shift in diet, which we really need at this point if we are to stay on target and, reduce the impacts that we're having on the planet, be it with carbon emissions, but also not that, even things, environmental pollution from agriculture, even to the people involved in the supply chain as well. That's a huge social dimension to the way our food is produced. So might potentially be a bit of a tricky question, but for you, I wanted to ask you to summarize. Let's say if someone was like, I don't really care about sustainability. Why do I even have to do it? What even is it? How would you explain in a concise way what a sustainable diet really involves and why they should do it? Anyone want to have a go? A short summary?
I'll try and do some, and then Yue will help me. I think first off, it's a diet, so it has to be pretty varied. So it's not just you eat one particular thing and that's all you eat. And I think another important part is that it kind of your sustainable or plant-based diet is draws on your local or like the food that you're used to. I think there's like oftentimes sustainable food is seen as like a lot of the things that are sort of recommended to eat are often very Western centric. Or so I think just having food that is like draws on the local diet but is environmentally conscious of the ingredients that go into that dish is important.
I think Iris did a good job, but I'll try and make that even more concise into one sentence in case this guy is really impatient and doesn't want to hear more. But I'll just put it like, some foods you eat does not allow it cannot be produced on a long-term scale at this rate. So if we want to keep on living and keep on eating and feeding the up to 10 billion people on our planet, we will have to eat we'll have to avoid eating certain things. And those certain things, even without them, there's still thousands and millions of different options you can choose from. And it's all just about making some choices.
Well done, well done. That was a tricky one, but I feel I'm so glad that you two took so much away from that experience of that summit and are also now able to communicate it very well to other people, which is exactly what we need. We need more young people, people more generally, having these conversations around the dinner table about what you're eating, where is it from, what are the processes involved to get it from the soil, the water, the ocean to the dining table. So that's really incredible. And I think that it's fantastic that you two were involved in organizing this. So I think actually two last rapid fire questions, and we'll wrap up. The first being, what would be your preferred sustainable school meal? Like, could you highlight a dish that you think you would be your favorite? Iris, do you want to go first?
I think I could highlight one of the dishes we had during the Sustainable School Food Summit. I just remember the jackfruit meal. It was jackfruit, sweet and sour jackfruit that was sort of supposed to mimic the sweet and sour chicken. And then there was also a sort of, I think it was either a coconut pudding, I think, and some vegetables and some smaller sides. And I just remember thinking that that was a very well-rounded dish that also drew on, say, some of the local diets, and it was all had a variety of food on the plate. And like we replaced the meat with jackfruit, so there's some lower emissions from that, but also like there's it's a full meal, and everything in that meal is plant-based, and it's also very tasty and something that you're willing to eat. And I think that's just very important for sort of implementing more plant-based meals into schools and just more widespread.
How about you, Yi-Mei?
I just had a very nice answer, but I was just gonna say I'm a very big fan of tofu and mushrooms, and both of them are very nutritious and are much less harmful to the environment than something like beef or pork. So I don't know, they're really good. I really I don't have anything else to say.
Fantastic. So, last but not least, any final tip you want to share with audiences about adopting a more sustainable diet? Any advice you would want to give them?
I think you already said this, Belinda, but it's never all or nothing. Like, you don't have to immediately start cutting out all meat, go vegetarian or vegan. You don't have to do that ever, honestly. You just have to start maybe setting some small achievable goals, like I eat a smaller portion of meat. I try out a new plant-based protein dish this week. Maybe I like it, maybe I don't. These small achievable goals and see what works for you, because everyone has a different diet and everyone wants to eat different things, and eating is very important for our health as well and not just the planet. So just see what works for you and then try implementing these small changes. And small changes go a long way, especially if they happen over a long period of time.
Love that.
Um,
And you,
oh,
your Iris?
Kind of to add on to that, I think one of my bigger takeaways from just sort of digging deeper into the food system is just like you don't have to go vegetarian or vegan to be aware of the planet and have a sustainable diet. I think just being more aware of just the what food you're eating and being aware of the foods that have a higher footprint and eating less of those, and also minimize waste, because that's a very big because that would just it's kind of taking away from food that you could have other people could have eaten, and that's also a very big part of like the waste that's going into our landfills every year. So yes.
Fantastic tips there. And I love that you both covered the whole spectrum of different ways that people can create an impact through their choices. So, with that, we'll be wrapping up this episode. Thank you to Yi-Mei and Iris for sharing all your experiences and insights with us today. Really loved hearing them, and I'm so glad to hear that there is this next generation of young people that are really actively working to drive this dietary shift and raise this awareness about sustainable food systems. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in with us this week. We would love to hear from you about this episode, so let us know your questions and comments by messaging us on Instagram at @sustainapod_GIH or email us at sustainapod@gmail.com. With that, we'll see you next time.